Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium is the former teaching company. Great Courses, now a subscription service. You just go online, go to wondrium.com, and then add /Shermer, and you get 2 years for the price of one. What are you waiting for? Just go do it now, and then I'll tell you about all the cool stuff that they have. For example, not only the courses I produced for them, but lots and lots of long-form lectures, short-form tutorials, educational content of all kinds, how-to lessons, travelogue, documentary series, single documentary films, and so on. Here's one that just popped up. You'll see why I'm interested in it. In my feed, you just go to the app and you can either search by keywords or they'll just send you new stuff like all the time. Like, check this out, like other subscription services do. This one's called, here it is, The Apocalypse. Controversies and Meaning in Western History. I've written about this. I've had guests on my podcast talking about this, and it's a super interesting topic. This one is 24 30-minute lectures. Is there really that much to say about the end of the world? Yeah, everybody has always been interested in when the world's going to end. So here's some of the lectures. Revelation and the Apocalyptic Tradition. Yeah, it goes way back, thousands of years. Apocalyptic Worldview in Judaism. Early Christianity. The Book of Revelation. Have you tried to read this thing? Oh boy. Yeah. Okay. I think the author was on magic mushrooms or something. I don't know. That's actually a theory. Anyway, but that's just one of many. The symbolism in it, 7 trumpets, temple and celebration, the dragon and the problem of evil, the beasts and evil in the political sphere, the harlot in the imperial economy, the battle, kingdom and last judgment, the new creation and new Jerusalem, the Antichrist and the millennium, and on it goes. It's just phenomenal. When I was in college, we all read The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey about how the world was going to end, probably in the 1980s. I think he said by the end of the 70s, early 80s. Well, that didn't work out. He's still around writing books about the end is coming soon. This course will tell you why people like that are so popular, because it's a hugely interesting topic. So check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer, wondrium.com/SHERMER, wondrium.com/Shermer. Get 2 years for the price of one. Check it out. Thanks for listening. If you do not have psychic powers, you may not know that I am the publisher of this, Skeptic magazine. This is our latest issue, which you can get online at skeptic.com or at your local bookstore. This one is on nationalism matters. The previous one was on race matters. And then the one on that before that was on abortion matters. And the first one for 2022 was on trans matters. So we're taking on the deepest.
I like how you're steering away from anything controversial.
Yes, that's right. We're trying to be completely neutral here.
I think
People magazine.
You've used it up. I don't know what's next.
What's next? Well, the next one comes out in a couple of weeks. It's on money matters, income inequality, and crypto, and all that good stuff. And then after that, let's see, we have education matters, health matters, and there's one other in there. So we're hitting the big. Sex matters. We got to do sex.
There we go. Of course,
you and I will discuss sex because you talk about it in your new book. But let me give you a proper introduction here. My guest today is Paul Bloom, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and the Brooks and Suzanne Ragen Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale University. His research explores the psychology of morality, identity, and pleasure. Bloom is the recipient of multiple awards and honors, including, most recently, the $1 million Klaus J. Jacobs Research Prize. Sweet. Nice. He has written for scientific journals such as Science and Nature, and for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic Monthly. He is the author or editor of 8 books, including Against Empathy, Just Babies, How Pleasure Works, Descartes Baby, The Sweet Spot, and the new book. Here it is, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. This book began, as I understand it, Paul, with your one of the most popular courses in the history of Yale, right? The Intro Psych.
It did. It was built up from my classroom course. It's a 1 million-person course on Coursera online, and I figured I wanted to turn it into a book.
Right. I saw some of that. I saw some lectures on that, but there was other lectures on morality. Was that a different course, or was that part of that course?
It was a different course. I first taught a course on morality of everyday life. I found it very exciting, and then decided to go for a course on Intro Psych. And it was tremendously rewarding. I think I get emails virtually every day from people who've taken the course, and I'm very glad I did it.
How do you balance being a research scientist and a public intellectual popular writer?
By doing everything badly. I think.
Come on.
I'd like to hope that that's not the case.
It is not the case.
I think like a lot of us, I think certainly like you, I wear many hats. I'm a professor. I teach classes. I run a research lab. I write books. I edit a journal. I co-edit a journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And have a family. And, you do all these things. This book was sort of a special case. It's a COVID book. So there's a special opportunity to do it when I was spending a lot of time inside. I actually thought this book would be quick. I thought I had my lecture notes for Intro Psych, just kind of transcribed them. They were actually already transcribed as part of the internet. Make some changes, boom, 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 6 months, send it off.
Right.
And then I did my first chapter, which was Freud.
Oh, boy.
And all of a sudden at the end of it, it was 3 to 4 times larger than I had expected. And the book got very big.
Right. Well, I love the book. It was, I have a graduate degree in experimental psych, and I taught intro psych for 12 years at a community college. It was the evening class when I had a regular day job. Intro psych. I used Hilgard, Atkinson, and Atkinson was my intro text. So that's how far back that goes.
Classic text.
But I love that course because you get to cover so many different fields. So you're not locked into any one particular thing. So you open the book. I just like this opening because I have a big question I want to ask you about how you read this book by John Barrow, the theoretical physicist and cosmologist, called The Origin of the Universe. It began by describing Edwin Hubble's discovery that the universe was expanding, and then went over evidence for the Big Bang theory of how everything started. Your heart began to race faster. It was so exciting to know all this that I could be reading about events that happened 14 billion years ago. Actually, I think it's now 13.8 billion years ago. Perhaps it's what people of faith feel like when reading scripture, the experience of great truths being revealed. Learning about the universe, I felt insignificant, tiny in space and time, but I also felt proud of our species, that we could know so much about the incredibly long ago and incredibly far away, and that we could make real progress on the most fundamental of all questions. When the birthday party was over, I picked up the sun, world was full of light. Driving back, I talked to Zachary this is your son, about what I had learned. And as we spoke, I played with the fantasy of quitting my job as a professor of psychology, getting a new degree and becoming a cosmologist. But I was where I belonged, as you then quote great Immanuel Kant from his Critique of Pure Reason. I love this quote. 2 things fill the mind with ever more and increasing admiration and awe. The more often, more steadily we reflect upon them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. So Kant and the cosmologists and Barrow and the rest have tackled the first one, the starry heavens above. The moral law within seems to be a much harder problem. So here's where I want to start with kind of a philosophy of science question. How come psychology is so far behind the physical sciences? Is it a measurement problem, that the problem is just so much harder than physics? They talk about the 3-body problem, and we have the 3 billion body problem or whatever. And could we get there at some point in centuries hence, or is it just an intractable problem because of human volition or some other factors we can't measure?
It's a very good question to start with. And nobody knows. Someone uncharitable might say, well, the geniuses went into physics and the rest of us went into psychology, and that's why there's so much more progress in physics. But I don't think that that's the truth, really. I think for whatever reason, and it's not clear whether it makes sense to talk about some fields being objectively simpler than others or easier than others. It kind of depends on what kind of creature we are. What would be easier for one creature might be difficult for another. But for some reason, physics turned out not to be as difficult as psychology. I think in part it's because the physical world works according to laws, which we have to figure out. But the brain is just an incredibly complicated machine or set of machines, which just require endless tinkering. And a lot of it, of course, you can't. It took a long time before we were able to get into it and to decompose our mental processes in different ways to study it. So I think the problem is just much harder. But then there's something else which you alluded to, which is I think the deepest psychological problems blend in an interesting way to the deepest philosophical problems. Questions like the nature of consciousness, free will, and a topic you've written a lot about, morality. So in the end, I think the hard psychological problems are often also the hard philosophical ones.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I guess what I'm asking is, just like Kepler discovered that planets travel in elliptical orbits according to certain fixed laws, could we discover something like that about moral psychology, about conscious thinking and information processing and something? And it's just a harder problem. It takes a longer equation or something like that. Or is it a different animal altogether? I guess just a different way of asking the same question.
We could discover laws about the mind. And there's been various candidates for laws about the mind, mathematical principles, roughly akin to what physicists find. But I think as a rule, that's not going to be what our complete science is. It's like, suppose you're a biologist and you're not studying the mind, you're studying the kneecap. The kneecap's very complicated, a lot to learn about the kneecap. But I don't think in any case, let's find the laws of the kneecap. It's not kind of what your ultimate best science is going to look like. Rather, what it's going to look like is, here's how it works, here's how it all goes together. It's not going to be these very general laws like, F equals ma. Rather, it's going to be this part connects to this part. Or take evolutionary theory, connected to genetics, that whole program. Again, you have the structure of DNA, which is beautiful, incredibly rich, well worth the Nobel Prize that came with it. But it's not a series of laws. It's more, it looks like this. And I think success in psychology and neuroscience, for that matter, would be more like, here's how the machine works.
Right, and maybe the models are just more complicated, or maybe you need more theories. Here I'm thinking of like in moral psychology in your course,
Yep.
You talk about utilitarianism, kind of a consequential ethics, and then deontological ethics, which is rule-bound and rights and principles and so on, and then virtue ethics. Why do we have three? Why don't we have one?
So that's another fact, which is, to some extent, our minds are hodgepodges. It's not as if some philosopher thought it from scratch. Let's build a moral psychology into people. And we're not going to have all three of them, or four or five. We're just going to get one. Maybe everybody consequential, maybe everybody deontologists. The philosophy of Kant, the philosophy of Bentham. But the way the mind really worked is, it's a hodgepodge. I don't think we have any sort of moral principles in that simple sense baked into our heads. We have systems that have evolved to deal with our kin, those we love. Dealing with friends, and there we get into sort of different evolutionary story, reciprocal altruism. Deal with strangers, and that's an entirely different story altogether. And part of this is hardwired, but part of it is, of course, cultural. So your views on slavery, your views on what you owe to strangers, can be very different to your ancestors 200 years ago, because just of how you were raised. And so it's not going to be a complete coherent story. Some of it will be innate. Some of it will be learned. Some of our morality will be due to principles that are morality specific, I think, the sort of thing you get into moral philosophy. Others are more general, involving intuitions of causality or intuitions about number or consequence and so on. So it's kind of a mess. A good psychology would explain how it all works. But in the end, it's not going to be our moral psychology is, and I put up three equations on the board. Rather, it's going to be this cognitive system, that cognitive system, this story, that story, all interacting together.
Yeah. Another idea I've been playing with is different kinds of truths. So you have like objective empirical truths. The dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. The Big Bang started 13.9 billion years ago. So on. And we can say with reasonable confidence, provisionally true with a small t, that's it. And it's not likely to change dramatically, just refined. But then you have something like pure, subjective truths, like meditation works for me, or I like Stairway to Heaven, or whatever. And then somewhere in between, you have something like political truths. What's the right number of immigrants we should allow each year? I'm not sure that's even the right question. Maybe there isn't a right answer. Maybe it depends on the kind of system you set up. And then science can say, well, objectively speaking, if this is your goal, this is the number of immigrants you should have. But if that's your goal, that's a different science.
That's right. I mean, I could add to your list. There are sort of social truths. So in baseball, 3 strikes and you're out. It's not, a scientist wouldn't discover it. It's a human invention. But then if you were to say, well, then it's all arbitrary, you're wrong. If you think it's 2 strikes or 4 strikes, you're just mistaken. You don't know how to play chess if you think the pawns move forward 5 spaces. So sometimes arbitrary facts in the minds of people who could communicate and form things develop a truth to it. There's a truth to how long, how many times a president can be reelected. There's a truth to the sales tax in Toronto. And these are as true things can be, even though they can change, but there's sort of things you can be right and wrong about. And I think there's, we could talk for hours about ways in which we're similar to animals, non-human animals, and ways which we're different. But this world of social facts that we navigate in is certainly uniquely human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. One last point on that with talking about one of our mutual favorite subjects, Jordan Peterson, or if you're tired of talking about him, we talk about Joseph Campbell or any of the mythologists. But, mythic truths, that say some story is completely made up, of course, but the story itself contains some truths about human nature. Take Shakespeare, Jane Austen, or any of the great novelists, Dostoevsky, and so on. We wouldn't ask, is it true in some kind of literal sense, where they're really brothers Karamazov in Russia in 19th century? Well, that's missing the point.
Yeah.
And so, it's hard to pin Jordan down on this. Like, do you actually believe Jesus lived and was crucified and then after 3 days was raised from the dead? Or is that a mythic truth? It stands for something else. And sometimes I think some of psychology is in that kind of that gray mythic realm there.
Maybe. I kind of hope not. I have not much sympathy for mythic realms. I don't know whether Jesus walked the earth, but it seems he either did or he didn't. It's not very complicated. Maybe he did perform miracles or he didn't. And you can believe one, you can believe the other. Now, whether or not it seems totally compatible to say, no, it's just a story. But the story captures some important morals we should pick up. I think that's fine. I think that's totally fine. I could tell you, I tell a young kid a fable about, I don't know, a girl who cried wolf. And is it true? No, it's not true. I just picked up that story. Does it capture a good moral? Sure. But I worry sometimes that too many people we both know trying to mystify things. Oh, you can't talk about the truth. It's true. Is there a God? It's true. It's not true, and everything. I like to reserve truth for things that are true.
Yeah.
Not just are true with a star next to it.
Believe in things that don't have to be believed in to be true.
You very nicely put. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Another big picture question. Much of your book is informed by evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, and theory. Yeah. Why did it take till the 1990s, like over a century after Darwin wrote on the origin or on the descent of man? What happened? How come psychologists didn't glom onto that obvious, what seems like in retrospect now, obviously that has to inform psychology?
It's a good question. When you date it to the 1990s, I think you're thinking of the work by people like Leda Cosmides and John Tooby.
Yeah, or you can go back to the 70s with Wilson and Trivers and so on.
Yeah,
so Descent of Man was like 1873, I think, or 71. So a century.
Yeah. It's a really interesting sociological question. There has always been, ever since Darwin, people using the tools of evolutionary theory to explain and explore aspects of our human nature, of course, including Darwin himself. But there's no shortage of great scientists like Robert Trivers or Paul Ekman, who before those dates did some really extraordinary work. But you're right that there's been a lot of resistance to it. And I think the resistance has two sources. One is, for whatever reason, psychologists love empiricism. They love the idea that the head is empty, that other animals have instincts. William James, who was very much of a sophisticated thinker, William said that animals have tons of instincts and humans have even more. But psychologists hate that. They think, Darwin or God bequeathed every other animal a set of innate capacities and all that. But humans are very unusual and our heads are perfectly empty to be accumulated of culture. So Skinner came along, and Skinner had a version of you. Everybody loved Skinner. The modern day connectionist, neural network theory, it's just empty. Just learn. You got to train it properly. And people love that. For some reason, and I don't exactly know why, my colleagues hate the idea of innate ideas. They hate the idea of evolved capacities. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is there's always been a sort of political concern about evolutionary theory. Stephen Jay Gould, who I know you have thoughts about, very much championed the idea that a sort of idea that the human capacities are biological adaptations is somewhat unwholesome, not politically correct, not consistent, say, with Marxism or consistent with whatever view you have. And since psychologists, by and large, are progressive, the idea there's something unhealthy about this has persisted. I don't think it's entirely gone away, but I think largely if somebody says, here's the theory of, say, incest avoidance, and it's very grounded in evolutionary theory, like the one I present in my book. I think the response by most psychologists is, sure, that makes total sense. We could argue about this and that. My friend Brian Scholl points out that in the field of visual perception, which is the field he works in, nobody has ever doubted the idea that the visual system evolved for perceiving objects. It makes no sense without it. Try studying the architecture of the ear and hearing without assuming that it evolved or is built for perceiving sounds. And, you get nowhere. So, but when it gets to sort of politically sensitive issues, it gets more complicated.
Yeah. I think some of that has been teased out by our mutual friend Steve Pinker in The Blank Slate, one of the great books, that there's a fear of determinism. So you mean it's all wired in and I can't do anything about it. And then a fear of eugenics. So post-World War II, that became a boogeyman. Even though in the 20s and 30s, eugenics was promoted by progressives. If we're going to engineer society from the top down through laws and legislation, we should also engineer it through genetics, right? So, and then you talk about this a lot, dualism. The fear that there's no ghost in the machine, there's no soul, there's no mind. It's just mechanical protein, and that doesn't feel good. And it doesn't, and intuitively, it doesn't feel like that, right? It feels, well, you call it natural born dualism. I always quote you on that. It just feels like I have thoughts floating around up there.
Yeah, so much of modern psychology, for better or worse, doesn't fit our intuitions. Modern psychology says our brains have evolved through natural selection, and so much of our thought patterns and how we deal with the world is a result of our evolutionary history shared with other animals. And that doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right that our thoughts are due to our physical brains. We are, I think, natural-born dualists. In fact, to believe your thoughts are the result of your brain implies that when your brain goes, so do your thoughts. And that's bad news for anybody who wants life after death. And the determinism, the sort of say, well, I lectured in my class on intro psych, a very smart bunch of students. And I said, well, so why are people different? Where are personality differences, intelligence differences? And I wrote down on the board, overheads, there's genetic factors determining it. Then there's environmental factors. Environmental factors can be within the family or outside the family. And a student came up to me afterwards, very sharp student, and said, well, what about choice? Where's choice above and beyond that? And I believe in choice. I'm a compatibilist for these things. But I think the idea of choice is a magical thing that floats free of everything else really is magic. I'll also add something else to the sort of political talk, which is Chomsky, who's, of course, the most progressive of progressives and still around in his 90s, making all sorts of trouble, argued that basically people think that innate ideas is somehow politically bad news. But he turned it around. He said, the idea that humans are infinitely malleable is in some way, if it's true, it's true. You got to face that. But you probably wouldn't want it to be true because he puts it, a blank slate is a dictator's dream. Authoritarians all around love the idea that people are infinitely plastic. Because want to make people hate their children? You can do it. Want to make people give up food to worship their leader? You can make people do it. And once you acknowledge that people have appetites and desires and complicated structure, in some way it gives you more respect for the individual and less of a sort of idea that you could mold people to any way you want them to be.
Okay, let's hit this. Let's just kind of go through the biggest questions that you cover in your book. Let's start with the mind, how the mind works, or the brain, if you prefer, since the mind really is just a word to describe what the brain is doing, right? It's a process that operates. So how does it work? And how does neurons swapping chemicals across synaptic gaps give rise to what we're doing in the sense, the experience of life itself? And because from there, everything else follows, right? I mean, how does the perceptual system work? We assume there's a reality. How accurate is our perceptual? That's all tied in with the brain.
Yep. That's an easy one. Nobody knows.
Okay. Nobody knows.
So this distinguishes what we do know and what we don't know. I think we know. I know there are people who disagree with this, but I think this is kind of gospel from psychology and well-founded gospel that, like you say, the mind is just the workings of the brain. That everything happens, all of our thoughts and everything is because of this disgusting lump of cells between our ears. And that's just the way it is. And we know this in a million ways, through philosophical arguments. We also know because, we could monitor the functioning of the brain and predict what you're thinking about. If damage to the brain can affect the most intimate aspects of your thoughts, there's every reason to believe it's the brain that does it and not some sort of immaterial. So how does the brain do it? How does the transmission of neurotransmitters across synapses between different neurons, the firing of neurons, either themselves or in assemblies, all of that, Mr. Goss, how does that give rise to the feeling that you're talking to a friend on a podcast and there's some sun shining through the window and you're tasting some tea over there? And how does that all happen? We don't know. That's a real toughie. But we have made through, not so much through psychologists, but for people like Alan Turing, we have made a discovery, which has made a discovery that physical things can do intelligent activities. So this was discovered a while ago through the invention of the computer. And now we deal with something like ChatGPT, which we could talk about that, whatever it does. In some ways, it's pretty damn smart. And so we have an existence proof. If somebody like Rene Descartes, a dualist, came back and said, it is impossible, as he said, to have a physical machine act in complicated ways. Therefore, you aren't a physical machine. You say, let me show you a computer. My computer could play chess with you and win. Bet you didn't think a physical machine could do that. And then Descartes would have to concede, well, okay, I guess physical machines can be intelligent. But now there's the next step. And this is what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is, how does this physical gunk not just solve problems and play chess and navigate, but feel the pleasure of an orgasm, the pain of having your hand slammed in the car door, all of that stuff. And again, we know it does. How it does it, it's a matter of a lot of debate.
Right, because the question I always like to ask when Watson beat Ken Jennings, the greatest Jeopardy player of all time, does Watson know that he won, that he beat the great Ken Jen, that he's, the world champion? No, he doesn't even know he's playing Jeopardy. And that's not even the right way to phrase the sentence. Does he know? There's no he and knowing or whatever, or feeling like, Data on Star Trek. Was he excited when Captain Kirk walks on the bridge? You talk about Star Trek in there. And so that's the other mind's problem. Yeah. Maybe this is what Thomas Nagel calls one thought too many. Like if you ask a physicist, if you ask Barrow or any of these physicists, why does gravity act the way it does? Or why do objects in space like planets have gravity? They may say something like, it's just in the laws of nature. That's the nature of the universe. That's the answer. Consciousness, it's just a property of material stuff. Dogs have less than humans. Cockroaches have less than dogs. Whatever. It's just built into the system. That's all. That's the answer.
But it's a question we can't duck. You may be right. So for instance, one theory of consciousness is a product of certain physical systems. So John Searle famously said, only brains can be conscious. A computer can't be conscious. It's just computation doesn't make you conscious. Other people say, no, consciousness arises from computation. And you might think, well, philosophers could just go away and argue this back and forth for another 5,000 years, see what they do. But I think this problem is going to become real. Some guy, Blake Lemon, lost his job at Google because he insisted that the AI program he was dealing with was conscious and sentient. Yeah. And then he insisted, well, so it's not being paid. It should speak to a labor lawyer. It's actually a slave. What it's like to be trapped and unpaid and everything like that.
Right.
So he booted him out of Google, or suspended him maybe. And a lot of people like me said, well, he was silly. The machine was not conscious. The machine talks a good game, but not conscious. But sooner or later, it's going to talk a better and better and better game. And then one day you're going to be talking to a podcast guest, and it's going to have a face, it's going to move around, but it will in fact be an AI. And it will say, like I'm saying to you, I'm fully conscious. And it matters whether I'm right or not, whether I am conscious, because if I'm not conscious, you do whatever, you shut me off, you could do experiments on me. If I am conscious, I have rights. You can't harm me, you can't kill me. And I don't know. Do you think this is just science fiction, or do you think that within our lifetime we're going to be faced with this question in reality?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's the other mind's problem. How do I know you're conscious? The philosophical zombies. Maybe I'm the only one on the planet, and everybody else is just a machine. But to solve this, I apply the Copernican principle. I'm not special, and your brain is structured like mine, so it's very likely if I feel things, so do you. Now, in principle, it should be substrate independent. It doesn't have to be neurons. Why can't it be silicon chips? And therefore, at some point, if data's an actor, plays the role pretty well, but you could, in principle, have a data-like character who has everything that seems like he's sentient, the same as us. So it would be reasonable to offer our provisional assent. Yes, that is a sentient being. Seems to me.
You think we're going to come across such beings in our lifetime?
I hope so. That would be fun.
That would be fun, wouldn't it?
It's one of my best arguments for being chronically frozen and brought back 500 years from now, so I could see how it all worked out.
Yeah.
Oh, the hard problem. Oh, that turned out to be easy in the 23rd century. Here's what we did.
I am very curious. And it's a question which bears a lot as a professional psychologist, which is that, if a machine like ChatGPT, which works on relatively simple principles, just a whole lot of them, can become conscious, that tells us some potential things about human consciousness and human intelligence. But mostly it's just going to be freaky if it turns out that within 20 years, along with us, there are, say, a billion other conscious entities, AI programs, living with us, whose rights matter just as much as ours, and perhaps are smarter than us.
Since you wrote about Star Trek and you also write about emotions, this is a good time to bring in. I had Leonard Malad now on the podcast. He's a physicist and Stephen Hawking's co-author, but he also wrote a book on emotions. So we were talking about emotions. What's the purpose of emotions? Why did they evolve, and so on, as proxies to drive behavior to get organisms to do things. And so, but he also wrote for Star Trek: The Next Generation, for a couple seasons. Yeah. So he and the script writers would go, okay, we have to have data do this and data do that, but in fact, if data really was just a computer, he would just be sitting there on the bridge computating whatever. And, you'd have to program in, when Captain Picard walks on the bridge, you are to stand up, greet him, and act like you're excited to see him or whatever. You'd have to program it in. Otherwise, they wouldn't do anything.
Yep. It's a point Steven Pinker makes a long time ago, which is they say Spock and Data, everything, have no emotions. But plainly they have some motivations, or else you just sit there perfectly still. They, so they want to, they're responsible. They are often heroic. They often have flashes of humor, companionability, and so on. And to say that they don't have emotions in the end just means that they aren't very expressive about it. They don't cry. They don't laugh. They don't do contractions. They say he is and not he's. And look, it kind of looks cold. But if you think there's no emotions in these entities, then you have the wrong theory of emotions. Because you're right. Emotions are what's needed to push us around. If a creature comes running at me and I run away, it's hard to explain that without fear.
Right. So maybe it's a mistake, a category error perhaps, to distinguish reason from emotions or rationality from emotions, or something like that. They're not two completely separate. As if data just needs a chip. We got to put the chip in there.
An emotion chip. Yeah.
Right. The emotion chip. Right. And so let's just think about this. For example, attractiveness. What do I find attractive? Well, I like a hourglass figure in a female because I'm a straight guy, and that 0.67 waist to hip ratio. And turns out, evolutionary psychologists have a theory about this. Okay. But I would never walk around with calipers going, okay, let me see what the measurement is. I just look and go, yep, that looks good. And so that feeling like I'm attracted or lust or whatever it is a proxy for natural selection did the calculation for me already over millions of years of what's a proxy for health or something like that.
I think that's a deep insight for how to think about the mind. Really sort of step one for thinking seriously about these issues, to appreciate the difference between why something evolved and how it currently works. So William James is good on this. William James says, well, why are we hungry? It's a no-brainer from an evolutionary point of view. Animals that don't get food into the system die. They don't reproduce. So we seek out food. But if you ask somebody why they're hungry, he has this line, instead of revering you as a philosopher, he will laugh at you as a fool. He's hungry because he wants to eat. He's hungry because his mother-in-law made something good and he wants to show it out how much he likes it. He's hungry because it's 7 o'clock. That's when he eats. Take another example. People are typically not sexually attracted to siblings. Why not? Even if your siblings are very hot, objectively speaking. Well, because evolution 101. Don't have sexual intercourse with your siblings because the children will grow up very poorly. Of that offspring, there's serious genetic costs. So we've been wired up to avoid our siblings. But at a gut level, it's not like somebody says, oh, I don't want to sleep with my brother because I don't want to have bad children. Rather, it just shows up in their gut feelings. You know, if I smell some rotten hamburger, I have a feeling of disgust. And in it, there's a logic of infection and microbiology, but I don't know that. I just feel the disgust. So emotions are something very smart, but we don't see the smartness of it.
And when you talk about Danny Kahneman's System 1, System 2 thinking, System 1 being this kind of rapid cognition, heuristics, biases, instincts, whatever, intuitions, System 2 being the more rational calculating. Is System 1 really more like emotions, a description of emotions? It's just kind of pushing you to make a snap decision because who has time to sit there and do all the calculations about what's the right toothpaste I should buy? And you sit there for an hour, kind of doing all the computations. You couldn't function like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So Danny wants to kind of break up the mind. As he well knows, this is a very traditional way of looking at things, into sort of gut feelings and considered thoughts, and talks about how they relate to each other and how different parts work. I think he would view the emotions as more into System 1, more in the gut, and less reflective. And because they're fast, they're often fast, they're automatic, and they're very useful for us in a fraction of a second. The flash of fear or anger or grief, you don't need to work it out and think about it and kind of work out a thing. You just get it right immediately. It feels like it comes to you. You know, somebody's talking to me and they're being very rude and disrespectful. I feel an anger rising within me. And it's like this alien force possesses me. I didn't consciously decide to be angry. But like you're saying, there's an intelligence in the emotions.
Right. It's a kind of a form of rationality.
Yeah.
The subtitle of my conspiracy book is Why the Rational Believe the Irrational. It's not irrational to believe a lot of conspiracy theories are true. That is, they reflect real conspiracies because there are real conspiracies, right? So it's a little bit like all the famous social psych experiments, like the smoke in the room, and the idiot sits there filling out his form while everybody else is ignoring the smoke pouring in, and they're all shills. But in fact, our social group is a reasonably rational source of information. Like poll the audience in that game show. They get it right most of the time. So that would be a heuristic, I guess. Follow what the crowd does, because most of the time they're doing the right thing.
So let me try it on you, because I talk about conspiracy theories in my chapter on rationality, and I'm making the argument that people are much more rational than we give them credit for. We're really smart. And so I say, well, the common response is, if we're so rational, how can we believe in all these crazy conspiracy theories? QAnon and the moon landing was a fake, and choose your conspiracy theory. And so you're the expert here. So here's the line I take is that one thing, and this one I get from people like Pinker and Hugo Mercier and others, is that sometimes our conspiracy theories are just playful. They're like crazy celebrity gossip. They don't really connect with us. Other times they have more weight, but they serve more of a social function than a truth function. In that, if everybody around me believes in QAnon, it might actually behoove me to believe in QAnon, not because it's true, but because it's as a creature who wants to survive in this world, it's really important not to alienate my social group. So how does that fit with your analysis?
Yeah, it fits perfect. I call that proxy conspiracism. That is, the conspiracy theory is a proxy stand-in for something else. Whether it's true or not is beside the point. So Pizzagate, is Hillary Clinton really running a secret satanic pedophile ring out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., Comet Ping Pong? One guy believed it, Edgar Welch. He went there with his gun, made a long video to his daughters. I'm going in. This is got to break up the crime. No one's doing anything about it. Which is, Hugo Mercier points this out. This is what you would do if you thought there really was a crime going on, and no one would do anything about it.
Yep.
Right. But most people, when they, tell the poster, I think there's something. Do you think there could be something to the? Yeah, I guess there could be. I'm a Republican, and most Republicans believe. Yeah, okay. Such that if I took you there and said, look, there's no pedophile ring, there's not even a basement, you wouldn't go, oh, in that case, I guess I'll vote for Hillary, right? You were never going to vote for Hillary. It's just that's one of those things, those crazy Democrats or the evil Clintons, or, it's a stand-in for something like that. My other type specimen is the OJ trial, which, OJ was acquitted on a conspiracy theory. The LAPD planted the bloody glove and the rest of the evidence. But for the mostly black jury, the history of the police engagement with the black community in LA since the 1950s was pretty bad. They used to do things like that. Maybe they still do, I don't know, but planting evidence, this guy may get off. We know he's a bad guy. We know he has priors. Let's just plant the evidence and make sure he's, put away for good. Whatever their argument is, something like that. So to a black jury in 1994, that's not an unreasonable conspiracy theory, even if that one wasn't particularly true. So it's a stand.
Yep. And there's a deep point you're making here, which is sometimes these things could be irrational if you assume that the point of rationality is to get you at the objective truth. Then you shouldn't believe in Pizzagate. The evidence is really weak. It's kind of dumb. But that's not a good definition of rationality. Rationality is basically trying to achieve your goals. And people have many goals. In the O.J. Simpson case, maybe their goal isn't to find the truth or innocence of a man. The goal is to retaliate against years and years of vicious racism. The goal is to show solidarity with their group. The goal of the Pizzagate person might be to say, boo Hillary. There's all this stuff. A lot of Republicans at different times said that Barack Obama was not an American citizen. He was born in Kenya. Oh, that's a stupid conspiracy theory. Then somebody did this poll where they asked Democrats, do you think Donald Trump was born in the States? And many of them said, no, he wasn't born in the States. And what they were saying was, boo Trump.
Right.
You asked me a question like that, and yes, no, well, I'm going to give you an answer, which is a boo Trump answer. And to tag me as being irrational, I think misses the point, is a very ungenerous way of how our minds work.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I've spent most of my career debunking crazy ideas and weird things. So it's skewed my perception of human rationality as being mostly irrational. But I've been rethinking this, again, your work, Hugo Mercier, Steve Pinker, and so on, others, that in fact, most people, let's just take cults. Why do people join cults? And you can Scientology and, the Heaven's Gate and Jim Jones, Jonestown, all that stuff. That you can come up with half a dozen examples, and it's astonishing that people did this. But in fact, most people don't join cults.
Yeah.
What's the base rate? How many people went to Jim Jones's church and never went back? How many people, engaged with the Heaven's Gate people for a few days and thought, well, this is crazy. We have no idea. How many people take those little personality tests at the Scientology offices around the world and they just walk out. They never sign up. They never take a course. We don't know. Right. So my guess is that, in fact, it takes a great effort on the part of cult leaders to really recruit people. I mean, it's like 20 steps to get them to get in there and give their money and give their sex or whatever the cult leaders are after. And in fact, most people are reasonably rational most of the time. That's what I'm now thinking.
So have your thoughts on conspiracy changed how you think about religious belief?
Yes, in fact, because I think religion is back to this kind of mythic truth. It's a stand-in for other things. Mm-hmm. And I think for most people who are not inclined to follow theological arguments, the prime mover and the cosmological constant argument and the fine-tuning argument, I think for them, it's just kind of, this is what I believe. It's my social group. It gives me meaning and purpose. I think most people don't give it that much thought.
Yeah. They're
not reading Aquinas and Dawkins and so on. I like to tell this story. I'll tell you this story that Dawkins and I were on stage at a conference on science and religion with Ken Miller. Ken Miller, the microbiologist, leading textbook author of microbiology, leading debunker of intelligent design creationism. Right? So we all turned to him and his book on this whole subject. But then the last chapter, he says, oh, by the way, I'm a Catholic. And I accept all the doctrines of Catholicism and so on. So Richard is kind of pushing Ken on this point. Like, okay, Ken, let's say we found a piece of the true cross, the holy relics that churches once had, claimed they had. And on the piece of the true cross there's a little bit of flesh, and we could extract the DNA from Jesus himself, who was, of course, born a virgin, so it can't have the same DNA as everybody else. And Ken could see where this was going. He's like, Richard, I'm not claiming any of this is true. In the scientific sense,
yeah.
I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a conversation stopper. Like, okay, well, what do you say to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Dennett calls it belief in belief. Where people who tell you they believe in heaven, and they're not lying to you. They believe in heaven. They want their kids to believe in heaven. It's important to them. But then if you ask them, so what's heaven like since you're going to spend eternity there? And they go, stop. I'm not that interested. Do you fear death? If you think I end up in heaven, you should, of course. In person, yeah, I wouldn't want. I'm very careful. I don't want to step in front of a car. I don't want to. But what about heaven? And it takes this funny status where they don't treat it as if I'm going on a vacation in 2 weeks to a resort. I'd be very curious about a resort and what they offer. They take it as sort of this social allegiance, this thing which is good to have, and it has very interesting status. And seeing it this way, I think, should make one more sympathetic to the religion. I think one problem that atheists run into is they see some religious claims as claims of literal truth. You think the world is such and so years old. Well, that's dumb. Let me show you the evidence why. But some people are literalists, but most are not. Most of these beliefs have a different sort of status, which means that they aren't to be thought of in the same way. Call them mythical truths, but they aren't to be thought of the same way as actual truths.
Well, maybe this is a good place to bring up free will and determinism, because for some people, I think free will or volition is a kind of mythical truth or a useful fiction, or I don't know, I've read this argument, I've read that argument, I read Dennett's book, I read Sam Harris's book, I don't know what to think. I don't know, I feel free. I'm just going to act like I'm free because that's how it works.
Yeah. It's there's obviously a tension, because on the one hand, you have a scientific worldview, which says that your behavior is entirely predictable from the current conditions of the universe right now. Maybe there's some quantum silliness going on, but put that aside, put that random aside. Where you are in an hour is exactly determined, and a god could figure it out, or even a powerful enough computer perfectly. And yet, it also seems irrefutable that you choose what to do when this podcast ends, where to go, what to do. And it also seems irrefutable that I view your behavior that way. Otherwise, I could never thank you for anything good you do for me, or or condemn you for any bad thing you do for me. So we seem to be in a perfect pickle where free will seems absolutely indispensable, and a gut feeling deeply true, but it violates our scientific worldview. And I guess I tried my own take is kind of compatibilist, where I think there is a notion of freedom. There's a real difference between you having a free choice on where to go versus somebody locking you in your room. It's a physical difference. There's a real difference between a machine that chooses by evaluating the pros and cons of different options, chooses accordingly, versus a machine that mentally flips a coin. And so we talk about decisions and deliberation and so on. And I think we should continue to do so, all the time recognizing that is compatible with a physical determined world.
Interesting.
There's a point which I think Dennett makes, which is a nice way to think about it, which is think about choice, our free will, on analogy with time. So we all have this conception of time. And scientists tell us that your conception of time is the truth is very different from how you see it. But we don't normally say, oh, time doesn't exist then. What we say is time's different from what we thought. And I think we should say the same thing about choice.
So there's always this question, could you have done differently? Is it that as I move forward in my life, I'm aware of the choices I've made in the past when confronted with certain variables from which to choose? This time I'm going to do different. I think the determinists would say, well, but the conditions or whatever are not the same. And that if they were exactly the same, you would do exactly the same.
Right. How could it be otherwise?
So let me give an analogy. Remember Steve Gould's famous, rewind the tape and play it again. Would we end up with Homo sapiens, back to the dinosaurs or whatever? And, Dan Dennett made the point, well, if it was a read-only memory tape, yes, it would be exactly the same because it's just a recording of what happened. But Steve meant something different, like just run the whole thing over and let it just play a second time. Of course, we wouldn't end up with exactly what we have. So it's not really a fair question to say, could you have done differently? Because if it's literally everything exactly the same, then it would be a recording of what happened and you would just do the same. but you can never replicate it exactly. So the conditions are always going to be slightly different, and you have knowledge of what you did last time. So for you, would the agent or the volition come in there at that point, go, I remember what I did, I'm going to do differently this time because I was punished or I was rewarded, or if you want to go Skinner on that front or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's two separate issues. I think I agree with the determinist that every time we make a choice, if we perceive it as a choice, we feel we could have done differently. I'm choosing the chocolate and vanilla, and I choose the chocolate. I said, could you have chosen vanilla? Of course, I was choosing them, which meant the vanilla was very much on the table. But the determinist comes in and says, you were destined to choose the chocolate. You had an illusion that you could have chosen vanilla. You were destined to choose the chocolate. And trying to reconcile those two things, our deep feeling of choice and the determinist logic, is, like I said before, really tough.
Yeah. It may be an insoluble problem. It may be one of those Mysterian mysteries, like, free will, God, and why is there something rather than nothing? These kind of deep questions. I like Dan Dennett's idea of degrees of freedom. So if you take someone who's an alcoholic or a drug addict, and I'm not, I don't have that problem, I have more degrees of freedom than the alcoholic has because I'm less determined. What does that even mean? I'm less determined than the alcoholic because of my physiology versus his physiology, which is programmed. There's no willpower on my part. I've just got lucky that I don't have the physiology that processes alcohol in that way. And he had bad luck. So what is that? There's something there.
Or consider coercion. Somebody asked me, you do me a favor and break into that car. And I do so. And then the cops find me. They probably put me in prison. So you broke into that car. I said, well, he asked me to. And I said, well, that's not a good reason. You chose to. But suppose he pointed a gun towards my head and said, break into that car or I'll kill you. Then I could legitimately say I was forced to break into that car. I probably wouldn't be held legally responsible. Now, you can imagine a philosophical police officer coming back and says, well, you weren't literally forced. You could have chosen not to break into the car. You chose to break into the car as opposed to dying. But there's some intuition that just as in your addiction case, there's some cases where we're forced and free will is lessened in some way. And the law understands that. The law understands cases of coercion or blackmail or threat as in some way dampening free will and thereby dampening moral responsibility.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this the other day. I had Steve Hassan on the podcast. He's a cult expert. Now, he goes way further than I do. He thinks pretty much practically everything is a cult. It's all over the place. I mean, he wrote a book called The Trump Cult, in which, I couldn't imagine he believed this, but I said, you don't mean 74 million Americans who voted for Trump are all in a cult, that there is undue influence and they're under his sway. And he said, yeah. It's like, I don't think so. I mean, most people just vote tribe. I don't like Trump, but he's a Republican. I'm a Republican. I'm going to pull the handle for Trump, right? But so there's this question of undue influence, like the Manson family. Bugliosi's genius here was to get the women convicted for murder because they actually committed the murder, and Manson also, even though he wasn't even there at the crime scenes, because he had so much influence over them. So there, I think that's an interesting problem.
It is interesting. These cases illustrate that maybe not that anybody needed to convince him, but these philosophical problems have real world weight in that who do you convict? Who do you charge? Who goes to prison? Who doesn't? Take Trump himself. I think some of the charges against him, basically amounting, or at least the accusations of basically treason, attempt to overthrow the government, rest on his facts about his intentions and rest on his influence on other people and his perceived influence on other people.
Yeah. So the January 6th insurrection, we know who most of those people are now. And these were not tinfoil hat, wackadoodle, crazies living in their parents' basement. They're regular people. Some of them flew there on their private jets, right? And they're careerists and jobs and families and kids and so on. But they really believed that the country's being stolen from them. The boss said so that morning, right? Yep. And then plus whatever tribal and mass hysteria, whatever else is going on psychologically. But there they were. So, that's the power of belief. Is Trump culpable on some level? Had he not, so counterfactual causality, had he not given the speech that morning, would it have happened? Maybe. Well, at first I said no, but then now it looks like there was a lot of planning by some of these right-wing groups to get there. They brought their weapons and plastic ties to tie up Nancy Pelosi or whatever they're going to do, and so on. So that had some foreplanning separate from Trump, although Trump led the whole thing since the day of the election, day after the election when he declared it fraudulent. So that probably fed into it. That's a hard one. I mean, my First Amendment attorneys I've talked to tell me it's a really high bar to go from speech to actual action or violence or whatever.
And it should be. I mean, a lot of people, including me, I think including you, have no love for Trump, but there are broader points at play. And if you make that bar too low, then all sorts of speech that we would want to encourage or permit at least becomes too risky because, and it could have some connection to violence. And so it's a difficult balancing act. To take it more generally, I like this discussion because it's working on two levels. So there's the topic of my book, which is the psychological explanation, and explain how do we explain conspiracy theories? How do we explain why some people grow up to be murderers and others don't? And those are the sort of bread and butter psychological questions. But this deals a lot with a sort of meta question, which is how do we take these premises of psychology of evolution and causality and materialism, it's due to the brain, and struggle to reconcile them with notions that we find for everyday life and for law. And that high level question is a really important one as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, that's why I like your work so much, because you do both of those in all your books. Here I was thinking of Adrian Rain's book. I can't remember if we've discussed this before, The Anatomy of Violence. So
I reviewed it for...
Oh, you reviewed it, so you know the arguments, right? So he has those two case studies. He's got the Mr. Off, the middle-aged school teacher, who became somewhat pedophilic with his wife's stepdaughter, his wife's daughter, and she catches him. He's in big trouble and so on, and then he gets a brain scan for various reasons, and look, there's a tumor in his orbital frontal cortex. They extract the tumor. His pedophilic feelings go away. He's back to school and so on. Then the wife finds some kiddie porn on his computer, and back to the brain scan. The tumor's grown back as well. Okay, then he has that whole section on Dante Page, the African-American man convicted for rape and murder of a woman. And Adrian was on the defense team saying he shouldn't get the death penalty because, and then he spends like 2.5 pages on this poor guy's background, which is like the most horrible upbringing you could ever have, such that you almost feel sympathetic for him. He's a single mom. She's drug addicted. Boyfriends going in and out of the house, all who beat up on him, hospitalized for brain, head injuries, and on and on and on, and running with gangs, and just horrible. And then by the time he gets to the point where he commits this murder, but so Adrian's point was that with Mr. Oft, you can see the tumor in the brain scan. There it is. Yeah. But you can't really see 20 years of a horrible background in a brain scan. But I think his argument is that it's tumors all the way down, whatever you want to call it. It's in there. And that's a kind of deterministic argument.
So by the same logic, he would take somebody who lived a perfectly normal life and nothing bad happened, and particularly no abuse, no tumor, who went off to kill somebody for some reason, and say, same for that person. I mean, if one thing is caused by the physical brain and caused by the past, then in a sense the other is too. But I think that kind of leads you to a conclusion which you don't really want to make. So you wouldn't if you end up letting people off because, well, what they did was not freely chosen, but rather caused by their genes and their brains and their past, you got to let everybody off.
Right.
We're only going to put people in prison who chose their evil act through transcendent free will that escaped their brain, had nothing to do with their history. Well, right. That's a very small, the prisons will be largely empty.
Yeah. So. That's a good point. Okay, another big question. What's the nature of reality and how do we know it? So, you're probably familiar with Donald Hoffman's theory of perception. I think his analogy is the laptop screen where you have the little trash icon and this icon, and that our perception is like a computer laptop screen where what we think we see is real are just these icons that represent something else. And I'm kind of oversimplifying his theory, but you're familiar with it. And that evolution did not design perceptual systems to give us veridical perception that is an accurate model of the world, but just good enough to get your genes to the next generation. So let's just use that as a starting off point. how did our senses evolve along with our brains, and to what extent does it give us some reasonable picture of reality?
Yeah, I'm not fully. I've heard Hoffman's argument in various forms, and I think there's a real insight to it, which is our perception of the world isn't veridical. You see this in optical illusions, but you also see this in our limitations. Just a tiny proportion of the light spectrum is visible to us. Dogs and other creatures and octopuses and everything have radically different perceptions of the world. And it's not like ours is right and theirs are wrong. Everything is filtered through tremendous computational processes. Where I departed from him is the idea that in some way we're not perceiving the actual physical world. And I never feel I understand the argument correctly, because from an evolutionary point of view, it really behooves you to know where the snakes are and where the cliff drops off and where the apples are. So it does seem as if we've evolved to perceive snakes and cliffs and spaces and apples. Not veridically, not perfectly, but, and I'd also put it another way, which is the enormous success of our science. The fact we have spacecrafts that can go to, other planets, suggests that we really do have kind of the world by the tail. We do have a sense of reality, because if we don't have a sense of reality, why are we so successful dealing with it? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think so. That's right. So I use like animal camouflage. The reason it works is because it looks like something else that most organisms perceive as being real.
A perfect example. Camouflage only makes sense if it turns out that the predator looking for you, sees the world in such a way that is gradient, so that looking like the ground makes it pass you by because it thinks you are the ground. But it's hard to tell the story unless there's something like looking like the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure a shark looks different to a dolphin than to me, because the dolphin's using echolocation and so forth. But there really is a shark, and there's really one end you want to avoid because there's teeth on the end of it. And, so that, whatever it is, there's some approximation to the way it really is.
That's right. There's always been a tradition of skepticism about the external world. Sometimes it's religiously based. Bishop Berkeley said, well, we have all these sensations. Why would God need to create an external world with it? Why doesn't he just give us the sensations? And I guess occasionally postmodernists would say, well, everything is based on what we believe and so on. But the best reason to believe in reality is that it really works. If I believe there's a rock in our way, and you don't, and we keep walking towards the rock, one of us is going to stumble over it and look foolish. And
who did you quote in there? The person that kicked the rock. I kicked the rock, and
I think it was Samuel Johnson who, when hearing about the claim there's no external world, kicked a rock and said, "I refute it thus." And that's kind of a cheap shot, but I think it's basically right. I think it's basically right. I think some things don't exist, and we pretend that they exist. But if believing in their existence allows you to navigate through the world, physical or whatever, it's a good piece of evidence that it exists. I also quote Philip K. Dick, who defines reality as something like, reality is what exists even if you don't believe in it.
Right. Yeah. That which exists, it doesn't go away.
It doesn't go away. Right. That's right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this is when we're piling up quotes, and this is in Hoffman's favor. There's also a quote by Anais Nin, which is that we don't see the world as it is; we see the world as we are. And there's a truth to that too. I look at my dinner, which has been carefully prepared, and it's all delicious, and it makes my mouth water, and it's the yummiest thing in the world. But the yumminess of it, and the wonderful warm smell of it, and everything, has to do with me, not it. For a dung beetle, I'm sure dung just smells and tastes fantastic. But that's just because of the way dung beetles work, not because of the fact of what the dung is.
Right. Yeah, and also kind of autobiographically, whatever actually really happened years ago or decades ago changes as I get older. And I had Marty Klein on the podcast. We just released it today, and he's a sex therapist. Anyway, we were talking about divorce because he got divorced, and And he said the first 10 years after that, it was entirely her fault. And then the next 10 years, it was kind of 50-50. And now I realize it was almost entirely my fault.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, so there's the reality, and then there's the kind of, not just perception of it, but evaluation of it in a different context.
It's an interesting case. I'm thinking in terms of actually marital arguments that are friendly enough, but one person goes, and I'm sure many people have experienced, one person goes, here's why I'm mad. You said this to me, you said this to me, and you did this. And the other person says, you have it entirely wrong. You started by saying this. I did not say that, da-da-da-da-da. And most likely both sides are incredibly wrong. One of the great findings of psychology is that our memories are not to be trusted.
Right.
I have my own anecdote about this, actually. I gave a talk once, a long time ago, and I was just beginning assistant professor. And I gave a talk on some work, a technical work, and somebody asked me really a mean question, a very pointed, critical question. And I got a bit upset, and I gave an answer, but I kind of lost a bit of control. And then we went back and forth and it was quite heated until something stopped. So I'm leaving, and then I get an email from the university later on saying, the students, and I agreed to this, tape my talk because they're doing a study on how people give talks. So they got my permission to tape. And they said, do I want to see what the talk looks like? Oh, okay. They sent me the video. I masochistically watched the video. And I see somebody asking a perfectly polite question to me answering in a polite, humorous, calm way. And it's going back. It was all in my head. And this wasn't 6 years later. It's like a week later. And it was humbling.
Yeah. Yeah. Carol Tavris has a funny story in her book, Mistakes Are Made But Not By Me, about this, one of her favorite childhood books that she still has. She has these memories of sitting on her father's lap while he read the story to her, and all the stories they told each other about the book, and so on and so on. And then she recently looked up the pub date of the book, and it was published after her father was dead.
Yes. Yes.
And that's like, where did that come from?
And that's the rule, not the exception. I once was at a party, and I was telling some sort of funny story about something that happened. And then as we were leaving, my wife says, she was very nice. She didn't say that at the party. She says, you know what story happened to me? And I said, no, it didn't. I remember it perfectly. But then I realized, oh, yeah, funny. It did happen to you. And then, but I heard it, and then it gradually kind of sucked into my head.
That's right.
And again, before people think that this is crazy talk, it always works this way. There's a million studies showing that our memories are hugely unreliable. They're highly reconstructive. I sometimes think that's one of our big findings of psychology.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Elizabeth Loftus's work on that. The Lost in the Mall.
Yeah.
It's poor guy's telling us an incredible story about being lost in a mall as a child, which never happened.
Yeah.
Where is he coming up with that?
I mean, her work on implanting false memories it really matters. And has such relevance for the legal system, where there's these terrible real world cases where people go through extended police interrogations. Often, I think, done in good faith. I think this person has done a crime. We're going to get them to acknowledge it. We're going to give them the data and everything. But sometimes, in some odd cases, the person is persuaded that they did a crime they never did and confesses. They don't confess because they're coerced in any simple sense. They confess because they have had a false memory of the crime implanted.
Right. Yeah, that's astonishing. I remember in the 90s, Elizabeth was facing this kind of dilemma where this guy named John Demunyuk, who was identified as Ivan the Terrible was at Treblinka, I guess. And now he's just some retired auto worker in Ohio. Is it really him or not? And people look rather differently, 50 years after the fact and so on. So his defense was like, these are false memories, and we're using the work of Elizabeth Loftus. So they call her up, will you, appear on the defense of Ivan, this guy? And, she's Jewish, and like, oh my God, I'm defending this possible Holocaust criminal. But it could be he's innocent, right? That's a tough one.
It is, or it could be he's guilty. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, but memories, we do have memories. Some of them can be accurate. What do we know about how memory actually works? How does an event causing neurons to fire get stored? And is it permanently stored? Is it always in there somewhere that you could, in principle, retrieve it with the right cues, or is it always evolving?
It's a good question. There's one of my favorite writers, crime writers, is Michael Connelly. And I quote a passage from his book where somebody sees a crime or sees something, and then a long time later is brought through hypnotic regression. And it's very much as you can imagine. What is it? Okay, now imagine it. Now you're looking at the car, Now, can you see the license plate? Yes. Okay, now what numbers are on the license plate? And that's totally bogus. So the story of memory is, first thing, a lot of stuff just doesn't get in the first place. If you don't attend to it, it disappears to a striking degree. If all of a sudden our screen flickered and went off and then went back on, and you were wearing a different shirt, I might well not notice. We tend to sort of, or the background picture changed to a different picture.
Change blindness.
It's called change blindness, exactly. So if you don't attend, it goes away. If you do attend, it could get into the system. But then it's easily malleable through the sort of questions we were talking about before. So it might be malleable because you have questions, it might be malleable because you have stories. There was a study done right after 9/11. Intrepid memory psychologists went over and they asked people right away saying, where were you when you heard when the planes crashed? And then later on, much later on, they asked, where were you? And surprisingly, many of the stories were so different. Because what happens is, for something like that, people would tell, oh, where were you when it happened? So they'd tell a story of it. But of course, then they're remembering the story, and the stories change, they simplify and so on. And then the original memory is gone. It's not like it's just been modified. And finally, brains are physical things, they're meat. And just through random decay, you'll lose memories. So no, it's definitely not a veridical recording. Hypnotic regression is bogus. A lot of memories recovered through sort of psychiatric intervention is bogus. You know, with all the good intentions in the world, so many of these cases end up implanting memories rather than recovering them.
Yeah, right. I've always had a memory of the day JFK was shot on that Friday, November 22nd, 1963. I was in third grade, and that the teacher took us out of class, and we went out and saluted the flag or whatever we did. And I actually have no idea if any of that happened.
Yeah.
I really have no way of checking. And, it was a memory I had, I don't know, like 15 years after the fact. And yeah, I do remember that. And actually now I think I have no idea.
The humility is good. We have to be humble. I remember Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, described landing in a country, a war-torn country a few years ago, and a few years before, and said, we were under heavy fire and everything. And then people took that, and it wasn't true at all. And everybody's saying, what a psychopath. Maybe she's got Alzheimer's. Maybe. That's how memory works. It's only when you have the misfortune to be an extremely famous person that somebody goes and actually runs the tape.
Right. But on the other hand, if I go under general anesthesia and they wake me back up, my memories are still there. The memory of my mother's face, yeah. I can picture that, and I know it's reasonably accurate. Yeah. Where is that? How is that stored?
Somewhere in the brain. For different
hippocampus
for different memories, we say frontal lobe, hippocampus. There's some evidence that different sorts of memories are stored in different parts of the brain. There's some fascinating evidence that for differences in memory, which always fascinated me. So the classic stuff is you have these people who have this terrible problem due to a stroke or accident, or sometimes surgery run amok, where they lose the capacity to form new memories. So there's a wonderful case, a very famous case of HM, but there's many others. Korsakoff syndrome with extreme alcoholism gives you this too. So you lose the capacity to form new memories. And there's stories of scientists who work with them, like Suzanne. Every day she goes over and says, hi, introduces herself for years, the same guy. And he just, hello, very, very polite, very nice to meet you. No memory. So you think he can't form new memories. But what's interesting is that he can form new motor memories. So you get him to trace something and in a mirror, and it's very difficult to trace something while looking in a mirror, but he gets better and better and better, suggesting that the part of the memory that stores that is intact.
Right. One of the arguments for uploading the mind into the cloud so you can live forever, I wrote about this in Heavens on Earth, it depends on this theory that memories are physical things that are stored in there. And if you had a brain scan of the connectome, if you created the connectome, all the synaptic points, you this kind of electron microscope of a neuron, and you can see the little dots. Those are the synaptic connections. And this is what they argue. In principle, if you had a snapshot of that, that would be the memory self. Kind of permanently stored. It's in there somewhere. So they sent me these articles when I was writing about this. Look, here's this experiment. The person's brought down for open chest surgery. Their temperatures are, super below freezing for a couple hours, so they can do this surgery. So the brain is essentially frozen, shut, not literally frozen, but it stopped, molecularly stopped, and then they wake them back up and the memories come back online. So they have to be in there relatively permanently, in some physical way.
Yeah. Yeah. Not permanently.
Not permanently, yeah.
But it does have a physical substrate. Yeah. And
that's what happens when you go from short-term to long-term memory. It somehow gets, the wire together, fire together, wire together. It's just...
Yeah. The term of art is consolidation.
Consolidation, right.
And that's when you get... So we talked about anterior grade memory. I feel very much in my intro psych mode to do all these terms. If you're in a car accident, you smash your head, often you'll lose your memory of everything that has passed for like 15 minutes. And the argument is that memory was in there. You disrupted it. It never got put into the system. And so it's gone forever. Right. You're going to have a hole in your memory forever.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the nature of the self. So related to this, there's this remembering self, right? The memory self. And this is what the uploading people argue, that's your true self. But my counter to that is a point of view self, that from one moment to the next, I'm looking out my eyes, I see you, and then I see you, and then this, and we're still talking. And that's the me. The experiencing me is just the point of view self. It's just that you can't copy. Such that if I copied my connectome and uploaded it to the cloud while I'm still alive, that I didn't go up to the cloud. I'm not up there looking through the camera hole here. I'm right here. Right? That's just a duplicate.
I am with you, man. I am married to a person I love very much, but she seems to believe that if she goes into transporter and they destroyed the original, and somebody comes, that's her.
I don't think so.
And a lot of people believe that, but I'm with you. I think that our individual physical selves define the boundaries of our consciousness.
Right. But why do some philosophers and even some psychologists call the self an illusion?
For different reasons. Some of them say because the brain is always changing to some extent, and because there's no single part of the head that's a self, what Dan Dennett called the Cartesian theater. Then there's no self. Now, I take it a different way. I think all that shows is there could be a self, there's a you, there's a me, we're different. But it's just not localized in the brain in any single chunk. But it definitely isn't here. It's in the head. Others have a more philosophical bent. Sam Harris, for instance, would argue that the principles of Buddhism and proper enlightenment serve to demolish the self, and you realize you have no self. I never fully understood the argument, despite having it patiently explained to me many times. I guess I'm still stuck with the sort of Cartesian notion that there is a self. It's the brain, but it's nonetheless, it's a self. I have a self right over here. I care very much what happens to it. I care what happens to you, but not as much because you're not myself.
Maybe if we think of it as like a fuzzy set of characteristics that can bounce around within a bounded category. So some days I'm more extroverted than other days, or I'm more open to experience, if you want to just go through the big five. But it's kind of bounded based on temperament. Personality is just kind of inherited. 50% of the variance is accounted for by my genes. My parents were this, whatever. And so that's my sense of self kind of continues throughout the lifespan. And while it can change, and some people can say, okay, I'm too introverted, I'm going to force myself to go to parties, I'm going to nudge myself to go over there and talk to somebody, but they're not that comfortable doing it because it's sort of still stuck within the boundaries. And maybe that's the self, this kind of fuzzy set.
Yeah, and it will change gradually over time. I think there's an interesting sense in which you're the same person you were when you were 1 year old. They have the same name, you track through time. If you were given a bequest at your birth to be given to you much later in life, you could claim it because you're that person. Then, of course, there's a real sense in which you're not, which you have transformed. And there's a very interesting question, both sort of from a philosophical point of view and also how we naturally think about it. How much changes would you have to undergo in your own head before you're no longer you. And so Nina Strominger and Sean Nichols and their colleagues have done some nice experiments where if I got a sort of severe Alzheimer's, severe form of dementia, where I not only wiped all my memory, but my personality changed and my intelligence faded. So there's an interesting sense where Bloom is dead. The original guy is dead. There's someone else in here. And can you imagine that? Can you imagine that there'd be a case of change that's so radical, you would say that you cease to exist?
Yeah, I guess it'd just be if it was Alzheimer's or something, where the spouses of Alzheimer patients say she's no longer the woman I've known.
Yeah.
And there, I guess it's a quantitative difference, but at some point it becomes a qualitative difference.
That's right.
The number gets so much.
That's right.
And that would just be what? Neuron death.
And I sometimes wonder about non-Alzheimer's cases. So I could imagine myself losing all my episodic memory, but still being me. Who am I wonder. And a split second when you wake up in the morning, sometimes you don't quite know where you are, at least for me. Imagine I'm more extreme. Still be me, though. But what if my personality changed in all sorts of ways, too? There's a certain point where I would think the person who occupies his head isn't me anymore. Like, what if I had, now we're entering philosophical thought experiments, but what if I ended up waking up with all of your memories, but also your personality? Wouldn't, in a sense, that be you inside my head?
Yeah, that's right. Well, right. What's it like to be a bat? You can't know that. And if I did, then I would just be a bat.
That's right. That's right. You can never know what it's like to be a bat. You know what it's like to be Michael Shermer inside a bat's body.
Right.
But to be a bat, you would then be a bat. You'd be unable to you'd have a bat brain, so you wouldn't ask the question. And if you recovered back into your own body, you wouldn't have no memory of it. Because how could you?
It's that Cartesian dualism again, like the Kafka's Metamorphosis. The guy is now whatever he was, a cockroach. I forget what the insect was. But that implies that something else goes into the animal that you're becoming.
That's right.
Like Freaky Friday when Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan swap bodies.
Yep.
Wait a minute, what swap? There's nothing to swap.
But it's so intuitive that there's a you, an orb, that could jump to another body, that could ascend to heaven, that could leave your body and look down upon it.
Right.
And I gave a talk about the book to somebody I was talking about a week ago, and his very first question was, "What do you think of past lives?" And I said, "Well, I don't really believe it." Was what kind of? And I said, "I don't really believe in it." I said, "But what about the soul?" And he then immediately said, "What about the idea your soul could leave your body and look down on it?" And my response is, "We certainly believe that's possible. So many people report it, but that's very different from saying it actually happens." And I do not think it actually happens.
Yeah. But back to the self question and the current controversy over trans. What does it mean when somebody says, I feel like I'm in the wrong body? Well, that implies there's a you, and then there's your body, like they're separate things, but that embodied cognition, there's no such thing. It's just you, so but again, you have these kind of fuzzy sets, male, female, you have all the secondary sex characteristics and so on. There's different threads along this line, but, one of them is that, well, if I'm a guy and, if I get the surgery and I have breast implants and grow my hair, the makeup and so on, I feel more feminine. But they're not really biological female. This is gender. This is more of a cultural, social thing or something. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that controversy without getting ourselves canceled here?
So there are a whole range of experiences that people talk about under the rubric of this. But I'll talk about specific experience because I know two people in my life who have had children who had some version of this. And take a case where somebody is a natal boy. Penis, testicles, indistinguishable from boy, biologically a boy, but believes, and I'll say herself, to be a girl, feels that they're a girl in the wrong body. And it's an absolutely fascinating question how that could happen. And it makes me think, in some way, the nativist part of me thinks that there may be a switch in the head for gender, male gender, female gender. But regardless, there are these cases that are very early emerging. So it's not part of some social epidemic or part of a byproduct. There are all these stories about later on, which I don't know much about, but it's very early emerging, and it's really real and urgent. And it's both, troubling because these people, unless there's some sort of intervention done, maybe by giving them the body they want, they're condemned to lives of misery. But it's also fascinating that it happens. And it's not so unimaginable. You don't need to be a dualist to imagine it. Here's a case which definitely is clinical, but it's nicely analogous. There are people who think they have one arm or one leg too many. They might think, I want my left leg amputated. And doctors say, there's nothing wrong with it. I cannot have this left leg. It is not part of me. And, it is possible that our mental map of our body, in this case for limbs, and other cases for the sex, is misaligned with how we see ourselves. Like, couldn't you imagine? Imagine you woke up at some point and you were encased in a female body. You would feel a mismatch. This is not what you're prepared. This is not how you see yourself, how you feel yourself. And I think that crazy science fiction cases matches what we find with some trans individuals. And this is why I think in some cases, intervention to make the body match more the person's gender is actually a just and kind and thing, to give them what they want.
Mm-hmm. The early onset gender dysphoria is, I think, different from the social contagion model of it happening in teenagers, where young teenagers' bodies are changing and they have some body dysphoria because of that, which is probably different from the early onset, as it's called. There was that movie, Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin. All of Me, right, where they switch bodies. And so, Steve Martin like, oh, this is what it's like to be a woman, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But again, would that happen, or would you just be a woman now? I mean, if you literally did that.
I think, you put this nicely, which is, we do want to retain, any good theory has to be complicated enough to retain the difference between, three things, actually. Biological sex. There's fuzzy cases, but Lily Tomlin's body is a female body, Steve Martin's a male body. Gender identity, what you see yourself as, which typically matches biological sex, but not always. And then sexual orientation, which is a whole different thing, like who you're attracted to.
Yes, right,
and
of course.
These three things, they typically align in a certain way. Typically, people with male biologies have male gender identities and are attracted to women. Female bodies, female gender, attracted to men. That's the norm throughout most people in most of human history. But then there's an enormous amount of variety. And I think I'm sympathetic to the trans activists who have really made us appreciate that these things can vary.
Certainly, like, let's just say this, think about this out loud. So within boys or within girls, there's a spectrum. There's masculine boys and feminine boys and tomboys and girls and so on. And so maybe at some point you're back to the sense of self. You have this kind of fuzzy set. This is who I am. And I have one set of characteristics, and I'm say middle of the bell curve, masculine male. But if I was shifted way to the left or right or whichever direction, at some point my brain may go, well, I'm kind of feminine, or I'm ultra maleist. Sorry, I'm speaking here. But that maybe that then becomes the self. Actually, I'm just kind of rambling here. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. Again, back to that kind of fuzzy set of characteristics. Like, what is a woman? All right, so I wrote this essay about this. It gets to that kind of problem of concepts, like Wittgenstein's what is a game?
Yep.
Right? And if you demand the philosopher to give you a definition that fits everything, it's impossible.
Yep.
What is a chair? It's a little bit like that. And you end up with, well, I kind of know one when I see one, or I am one when I feel that way. Something like that. You can't perfectly define it, but it usually works for most cases. Yeah. The edge cases being the exception.
So I talk about the evolution of sex and evolution of sexual desire and male-female differences. I find that issues like what is a woman to be, it's often used as sort of a political club by people on the right to say, you liberal, you can't answer that simple question.
Right.
Apparently that question, to answer the question, is supposed to be adult female, which seems like a terrible answer because then fine, what's a female? And then, and then you say, it's so obvious. Well, is the answer have to do with the genitals, or does it have to do with the chromosomal structure? Because they go in different directions sometimes. And all of a sudden things don't look so obvious after all. And you're where you are now, which is pointing out that categories can get complicated. And people who observe the complexity of the categories are not are not, necessarily crazy liberals ducking serious questions. They're just people thinking through things.
I guess it's the edge cases that push us to rethink the concepts. So let's talk about mental illness in that sense, because, this is defined by a set of characteristics. What's a schizophrenic? Well, or a paranoid schizophrenic or a bipolar disorder. And, psychiatrists have this kind of long list. All right, if you tick 20 of the 27 boxes, then you're likely to be in this bin of paranoid schizophrenia, something like that. That's again, part of that kind of conceptual category.
Yeah, and those categories are really contested. So I review in my book, this is the second to last chapter, right before I get to happiness, because you got to end on a nice note. But
on a high note.
I go through all of the major mental disorders. I talk about what their characteristics are, and I talk about their treatments and what causes them, and so on. And this sort of try to do state of the art in clinical psychology. I'm not a clinician, so I got to sort of shout out, I won't give their names, but more than any other chapter, I had experts in clinical psychology go over it. If there's a mistake, it's my fault. But they really, really help me correct things. But there's all your category questions now come in. And here's two ways to put it. One is, when does normal and mental illness begin? And that's a very, very important judgment. Quite a while ago, but not so long ago, the American Psychological Association viewed being homosexual as a mental illness. And so normal, that is a mental illness worthy of treatment. Nobody sees it. Nobody seriously sees it that way anymore, but things change. In the Soviet Union, dissidents were often viewed as mentally ill. How crazy would you be to want to escape from this wonderful communist paradise, So the brain is socially molded. And then you get cases where debates about autism, where some people say at least some forms of autism, I call it high functioning, aren't a disorder at all. They're just a different way of being.
Cognitive diversity, neurodiversity, right, to be respected. And my feeling on this is sort of mixed. I think back to most people who think about it have mixed feelings, which is there are some cases where we're too quick to diagnose something as obsessive compulsive disorder, an uncomfortable personality type, as mentally ill, as opposed to a different way of being that in some circumstances leads to a better, more productive life than people who don't have that. But then you get cases where, so here's where I'm not radical, here's where I'm sort of middle of the road and very much medical model, which are plainly disorders. An autistic person who can't speak or can't toilet themselves. A schizophrenic who has bizarre hallucinations and can't be trusted around other people. An obsessive compulsive or a phobic who can't leave their house. These terrible cases, leading terrible amount of misery. And that you got to treat. Would you treat social addictions, or whatever you call them, like gambling, social media addiction, shopping addiction, porn addiction, in a medical model way? Because in a way, there's no problem with porn if no one cares that I do it.
Yeah.
But or drinking or whatever, but if my spouse leaves me and takes the kids and I get fired from my job, well, I do have a problem.
Yeah.
But that we're using as a definition, consequences in your life rather than something in my head.
Yep. And when people define mental disorder, consequences are a heavy part. It has to cause some problems. If you're a narcissist, but you rise to success and become president or something, then it's not clear what to be fixed.
Just a purely hypothetical example.
Purely hypothetical. No president could ever be a narcissist. I don't know in those cases. In some way, let me try this out. I'm not sure it matters. Where suppose you have a gambling addiction that's messing up your life. Well, you're going to want to take steps to make that go away. If you want, you say, this is terrible, I got to make it go away. Whether we call this fixing an illness or coaching you through a problem, I'm not sure it makes much of a difference. It may make a difference for whether insurance companies pay for it. But for these in-between cases, maybe we just grant that they're fuzzy cases and then go ahead with there. But that doesn't, something could be not an illness, but could still benefit from treatment. If I'm shy and find it difficult to give a talk, and my job requires I give talks, maybe I benefit from some coaching and some help. And whether or not we call it, we say, I suffer from an illness, which is now being treated, I don't think matters that much.
Yeah, I see our mutual friend John Haidt just posted an essay yesterday on, kids these days. Is it really different than the rest of us older people saying kids these days back in previous generations?
And he argues it is, I guess.
And his answer is it is statistically. So that would be a consequential thing that, there's a spike in teenage anxiety and depression, suicidal ideation, cutting, and so on, more in girls than boys. So there's a measurable difference, but we're still using some kind of consequential criteria for deciding if social media is a problem or not.
I'm not sure that that's a problem. So there's a range of psychological phenomena, and I'm not sure if it's a problem to say we're going to block these things off as illnesses if they cause distress and limits of functioning. Now, it gets complicated because you might say, what if it causes distress and limits of functioning because of how the world is arranged? One issue which often comes up is that kids get diagnosed with ADHD because they're really bad at the age of like 7 of sitting perfectly still in a chair for 8 hours in class. You can say, well, what an insane thing to demand that they do. So we treat them as if they have a mental illness, while really it is society that is setting up these bizarre strictures. So I see that point. But if there was no way to change society, which isn't true, but if there were no way to do it, then you'd want to treat the illness. And then there's a second question, by the way, which struck me as very, very theoretically interesting. And I get to it at the end of the chapter. And here's where sort of experts weigh it in different ways, which is there's 2 ways to construe these problems, like schizophrenia or major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, dissociative identity disorder. One is as sort of punctate problems akin to getting COVID. So it's not like there's a whole range from you got a little bit of COVID to no COVID and so on, or breaking a bone. It's just you broke a bone, you didn't break a bone. There's some variation at a bone break, but it's not a continuum. But arguably, some of these things like major depression might just be there's really, really happy, there's okay, and then there's sad. You keep on going down the line. And at some point, society says, why don't we call from here on in major depression? Maybe addictions.
So you're saying we have to draw the line somewhere, like what's the drinking age?
That's right.
Well, it's a fuzzy continuum, but the law says it's that day right there.
Yeah.
The day you turn 18 or 21.
And in some way, it's sort of arbitrary. And there's no way around that. If we are going to have a society where you would decide who to get treatment or not. So psychiatrists in the Diagnostic Standard Manual, the Bible of mental disorders, say, I forget the exact number, but in order to have depression, major depression, you have to be sad you have to show symptoms for such and so number of days. Let's pretend it's 14. Then it makes sense. Like one day wouldn't count. By the time we get you an appointment, it's already gone. But there's nothing religious about 14. It could have been 15. It could have been 13. And so sometimes, even for mental disorders that are pretty clear, there's no objective cutoff. It's a societal choice.
All right, so let's shift into your final chapter, happiness, meaningfulness, purposefulness, and so on, in the context of this, and maybe throw in a little behavior genetics. To what extent can I control these sorts of things that happen to me? Let's just not use, paranoid schizophrenia where there's obvious brain chemistry, just neuroses or sadness or anxiety or whatever. And I'm going to choose, just to act differently. I'm going to act happy. I'm going to be an optimistic person. Can I do that? And, can I read the self-help books and go to Tony Robbins seminars and get myself all worked up and change my life? To what extent does that stuff actually work?
Yes and no. There's a couple of questions buried in there which have different answers. So one question is, can I, through sheer force of will, become an extrovert, become happier, become more conscientious? Probably not. I don't think the system works that way. Can I make choices that then intervene and change my life that can affect me and improve my life? The answer is probably yes, in all sorts of ways. Sometimes the choices may be, if I'm depressed, I could go outside more, get some sunshine, force myself to socialize with friends. That'll probably help me. If I'm extremely anxious, there's pills I could choose to take. And it's a choice. You go to get pills. And so in all sorts of ways, we can fiddle with our happiness and our personality, even our intelligence. You want to raise your intelligence slightly? Take an extra year of school. That gently bumps up the intelligence a few points. So we have, those numbers on a scale corresponding to personality, intelligence, how happy you are to a large extent influenced by our genes, to a large extent influenced by environmental factors we don't know anything about. But I do think that there are ways which we can change them. And I think that that's obviously one of the ways in which the science of psychology can have real human benefits.
What you can and cannot do.
Yeah.
What's the name? Oh, Catherine Page Harden, right? I love that you used her work. I had her on the podcast. I read her book, which I really loved. But she was talking something about the genes for divorce. And I thought, come on, there can't be a genes for divorce. Well, no, it's how temperament leads people to have a lot of conflict in a marriage, and that more likely leads to divorce. And then she sort of confessed that she's in that category. I said, "Are you trying to tell me you're hard to live with?" She goes, "Yeah."
Well, it could be.
That's really funny.
Yeah. One of the points that her advisor, actually, Eric Turkheimer, made is that for any behavioral outcome, there is a genetic influence on it. And you say, that's kind of crazy. How could it be genes for divorce? Well, there aren't genes for specifically divorce. Divorce wasn't around when we evolved. But there are genes for, your how easily dissatisfied you are, how open you are to new experiences, how difficult you are to live with. I'm sure there's a genetic influence on high school basketball. Not because there's some genes with the words high school basketball written on them, but because there's genes for height and strength and diligence and so on. And so part of her point, she makes several good points. Part of her point is this point that genes affect every behavioral outcome, sometimes to a small degree, sometimes to a pretty big degree. But another point she makes, which is really important, is that the extent to which the genes affect the outcome often depends on society. Here's a simple example. This isn't hers, but she cites it. Suppose people with red hair were shunned and weren't allowed to go to school and were treated poorly.
Gingers.
Yeah, they were ginger. There's tremendous discrimination against gingers. Now, under this world, certain genes that encoded for red hair would also encode for unfortunate outcomes in life. The minute society changed, and we say, oh, no more discrimination, it all gone poof, those genes would no longer encode for it. Right now, today, that's a fanciful example. Right. Here's a real example. Here's a U.S. example. Intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, has a tremendous influence on people's fate in life. It is one of the best predictors of longevity, wealth, you choose it. And so the genes that encode for intelligence encode for all of these things. I think some of that's always going to happen. I think no matter what world you're in, being able to reason, problem solve, and so on is going to be beneficial to you. If I was a hunter-gatherer and I had to team with another hunter-gatherer, I'd rather do one with a high intelligence than low intelligence. But in modern-day United States, so much of society works by filtering people through a very small number of universities, elite universities, that basically require very high scores on intelligence tests to get in. They call them the SATs, whatever. And from that filter, those people go on to great stuff. If you took away that system, you will then change the heredity. You change the force of intelligence. It would so suddenly no longer matter quite as much.
Yeah, you do cite the research that on the Flynn effect, IQ scores are going up 3 points every 10 years for the last century or so. Well, first of all, that can't continue forever, can it?
I think it stopped. I think it stopped about 10 years ago.
Yeah. Unless the society changed in some dramatic way. I mean, isn't the explanation that because we shifted from agriculture to industry to information processing, that the kind of tasks that the IQ test measures, like rotating figures in space and abstract reasoning, this is to that as this is to, and then you got to pick the one. Those things are they are expressed more successfully in a society like an information age. If it changed, then those wouldn't be important.
I don't exactly know why the Flynn effect happened. There's a lot of debate about it. Some people say similar to what you're saying, it's schooling, that we become we're in a world where abstraction becomes far more important than if you're like a farmer. But the point of the Flynn effect is really powerful because it speaks to your original question, which is the Flynn effect said very quickly our intelligence went up and up and up and up and up. And this, since this is way too quick for any genes to have changed, it must be environmental.
Right. And this would counter then the bell curve-like arguments that it's largely heritable. And if there are race group differences in particular, then that's mostly accounted for by genetics. This is showing that is not the case.
Right. It's very important to distinguish what we know for sure, which is within a group, certain traits are very heritable. To jump to the conclusion that between group differences are very heritable. So take one example I use in my book is take height. So you get a bunch of North Koreans. Within North Korea, height's pretty heritable. Taller parents will have taller kids. Within South Korea, height's pretty heritable. Taller parents have taller kids. The difference between North Korea and South Korea, a big difference in how tall people are, because it has nothing to do with genes at all. It's because the people in North Korea are starving and have less food, so they're shorter. And so you have this perfect case where the same genetic population goes off in two very different ways. The between group difference is entirely environmental, while the within group difference, the within group effects is heritable. And this is really important because I think the heritability stuff is, I think, as grounded science as we'll ever have. It's very clear. And in some way, it's common sense. It's true for physical traits. Nobody really doubts that tall parents tend to have tall kids. And it's true for mental traits as well. Too many people say, oh my God, that can't be true, or that's horrible if it were true, or oh boy, I hope it's true, because they believe that this entails that differences between Asians and blacks and whites and Jews, that has to be genetic too. But they're totally different explanations.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's perfect. Okay, what have psychologists discovered about what I can choose to do to lead a better life? And what does that even mean, a good life? Yeah. Happiness, fulfillment, meaningfulness, purposefulness, how are you operationally define those? And what are the factors that nudge them up or down? So
in some way, that's the question of them all. What's a good life? And as a psychologist, I have no expertise. I just study the mind and have run experiment. I've made the case, drawing upon a lot of different work, and in my last book, The Sweet Spot, for a sort of pluralist view on the good life, where a good life is one involving pleasure, but also involving meaning, involving social connections, involving morality. And if you start with that assumption, now we can then ask what correlates with these things. And certainly for pleasure and for a lot of these other things, I'll tell you the least surprising finding at all of happiness research: people with more money are happier. There was a period where people were denying that, and
I know
where you give lectures. My God, you might think money makes you happy, but it doesn't. But no, money makes you happy, and of course it makes you happy. It buys stuff,
Yeah.
It buys food, it buys freedom, it buys time with your friends, it buys healthcare, it buys safety, it buys it buys a lot of things. Happier. There's diminishing returns. At a certain point, if you're got $150,000, another $10,000 won't make much of a difference. Well, if you got $20,000, it could make the world of difference. And rich countries are happier than poor countries for the same reasons. Social connections matter a lot. There was a science paper that said the health effects of being lonely are about the same as obesity and smoking. You gotta have people around. Then there's some surprises. Surprisingly, there are not any sort of systematic sex differences in happiness. It's kind of surprising because in some way men die younger. Men are much more likely to get addicted to things, much more likely to be both the perpetrators and victims of violence. Women are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety, but maybe it all kind of washes out because it's about the same. Religion has a complicated relationship to happiness, and here's an area which I think you know a lot about. In religious countries like the United States, there's a positive correlation. More religious people are happier. But religious countries on a whole are less happy than more atheistic countries.
And they do less well.
And they do less well. And just about every measure you could look at.
Some of that religious effect, I think, is due to probably factors into the social networking part. They just have more. If you're just going with your spouse every Sunday to the group, and it doesn't matter what they're talking about, they have music and singing and free chicken afterwards, and and so it's a social thing. You get some of the benefits of that.
I think that's exactly right, and the studies support that. So the studies find out they do these studies where it says, well, what exactly determines how happy you are? And the answer isn't how much you read the Bible, how much you believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, how much you go to sin, how much you read the Torah, whatever. It's how often do you participate? The way somebody put it, I forget who was a researcher put it, a stone cold atheist who goes to church services a lot to please his wife, say, who's religious, will get as much of a happiness boost as the truest believer. It is very social. Yeah. One of the
the other thing about that on the money issue, I always, when that first came out, that research, I thought, oh boy, conservatives are going to use this to combat the idea of higher income tax. Don't you worry your pretty head about that money stuff. It's not going to make you any happier. Just ignore the yacht that I just bought.
That's right.
Because I'm not any happier than you.
Yeah. Don't.
Hey, buddy, I'll take the yacht and deal with my depression later.
You'll deal with the consequences of it.
Yeah.
One of the cool findings, which just becomes increasingly relevant to all of us when we age, is a sort of surprising U-shaped pattern in happiness where you're pretty happy when you're young, 18, whatever. And it drops, and you get like 50, 52. You're at the bottom of happiness on average. And then it goes back up.
Why is that, do you think?
I'm not sure. It could be a sort of shifting of priorities. It could be that once you pass a certain point, you're in some way, your mileage may vary different people, out of a certain rat race. And you're focusing sort of, David Brooks has a nice line, you're focusing less on the sort of resume virtues and more on eulogy virtues. Less trying to make a lot of money, less trying to get that top position, less competing for mates, and more trying to focus on relationships and being a good person, maybe being more moral. But as your priorities shift, they drive you to sort of more social connectedness and so on. But I don't really know why. That's kind of a guess. But weirdly enough, people in their 80s are pretty happy, sort of up until bad health really catches up to them.
Maybe it's like in your 40s and 50s, you're still in the rat race and you're grinding along, feeling like you're not doing enough. The fear of being left out or whatever. That sort of hedonic treadmill. You're never going to catch up. And then maybe at some point in your 60s or 70s, you go, oh, fuck it. I'm just whatever. I am where I am. I'm just going to live the rest of it happy.
Yeah, I think the fuck it point may be an exhilarating, jump in happiness was that I'm out of the game. I'm out of that game. And that can let you be happier.
Yeah, exactly. I think the point about just on the money issue a little bit, I think you mentioned the kind of the buying of your freedom or autonomy, time. Mostly, you don't have to think about money if you have enough money.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I forget which economist said this, but the poor have to think about money all the time. Every day. How am I going to make my payments at the end of the month? And at some point in my life when I didn't have to worry about that anymore, I just sort of realized I'm not worried about money anymore. Yeah. This is great. Now I don't have expensive hobbies. I just buy a new bicycle every 3 years or so. That's about it. If I was buying race cars, I'd probably be constantly worried about money because I don't make enough to do that. But if you figure out whatever it is that you do that is fun and you're fulfilled with it and you don't have to worry about money, then that to me is the value of it. Like my wife and I were on a vacation recently. We were in Cambria and she wanted to stay another day. Hey, can we afford to stay at this hotel, this really nice hotel, an extra night? I'm like, I don't know. I guess so. Whatever. I don't care. Just do it. Whereas before, 20 years ago, I would, I don't know. Let me check my budget. And, and it's that, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's just not having to worry about that.
Yeah. And that ends up with some interesting life advice, which is, because I think you're right. I think a reasonable goal is not to care about money. So there's two ways to get to that point. One is get a lot of money. Another one is to orchestrate your life so that you don't need as much money in order to get to that state. So if all of a sudden you built your race car habit and it became absolutely central to you, now you're setting yourself up to be very unhappy because you have to generate a lot more money.
Yeah. It's like I always say, if I won the lottery, what would you do different if you won the lottery? And the answer is pretty much nothing. I'd be doing almost everything I'm doing, except I would want to fly private. I'd want my own jet, because I've had friends that do this, where you drive right up onto the tarmac. You pull up next to the plane, you get out, and you walk onto the stairs. Like, oh, man.
You see,
but the few times that I never pay for flying first class, but when I have done it, when somebody else is paying or whatever, and I look to see what it would have cost, like $10,000 to fly to Europe first class or whatever, you get to the other end, it's like I could have just bought a brand new carbon fiber Tour de France level racing bike for what I just did, and I'm off the plane. It's over.
Yeah.
I got nothing to show for it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm less than, I just want enough money so I could always fly window seat. I could pay the extra money to move to window seat. Never get stuck in the middle again.
Yeah. Okay. So just kind of wrapping up. So the point, I guess, is that maybe happiness is not the right word. I've always didn't like that word because it kind of suggests that you're walking around with a beatific smile on your face, but that isn't the point, right? It's just have meaning and purpose and joy, and I don't know what all the adjectives would be.
There's a lot of versions of this, but the philosopher Robert Nozick talks about the experience machine, where you plug into a machine and you live the life of your dreams, and you don't know you're plugged in a machine. It's just it's some version of a matrix, but you're just lying there for the rest of your life, a lump. They feed you with a tube or something, and you imagine this wonderful life full of the greatest pleasure and so on. And some people say, just strap me in, plug me in. But I think a lot of people say, no, I don't want to just think I did great things. I want to do great things. I don't want to think I'm in fulfilling relationships. I want to be in fulfilling relationships. I don't want to leave the world. And to the extent one has that intuition, it suggests that pleasure isn't enough.
Right. Yeah. Remember when Cass Sunstein was hired by Obama to be a czar of whatever it was, behavioral choice or something like that? If President Biden called you and said, we'd like you to design some government programs to increase the happiness and purposefulness of Americans, what would you recommend? I mean, I don't know, just taking some examples, maybe more income redistribution because the poor really do have to worry about this. So we should raise everybody up, or universal basic income, or I don't know, universal health care. So people don't have to worry about health care payments, something like that.
All of those things would make people happier, but they all involve consequences, right? So universal health care, involves a lot of people changing their jobs and a lot of people being unhappy and so on. Income redistribution could have people leaving the country. I don't have any easy answers to that. I'd very carefully read what John Haidt has said about social media, because I think social media has had a profound role on our happiness, for better or worse. And so I'd be interested in that. But my first impulse is not to immediately change laws and tell people to do stuff to make them happier, but maybe to set up situations where people had more opportunity and more choices.
Yeah, maybe the Sunstein example is good. You nudge people.
That's right.
Just give tax breaks for not smoking.
That's right.
Or whatever.
That's right. I'm a big believer in the logic of the nudge, particularly as an alternative to some sort of coercion.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, governments do this all the time, right? I get a tax break for being married. I get a tax break for having a kid. I get a tax break for owning a home. So apparently the government does want me to do certain things.
You get a tax break for giving to charity?
That's right. Yeah. So we're already doing this anyway. This is Sunstein's point. Why not do it intelligently?
Yeah, no, I think
and use
right.
people like you that know what you're talking about, at least based on the latest findings. All right, Paul. Love the book, Psych.
Thank you very much.
The Story of the Human Mind. You're always working on new projects. What's next on your either research or writing agenda?
I'm planning to write a book on perverse actions. Why we do things we know are wrong. Oh. It's a very fun topic, and it's been in my head for years. And I just decided when I get started on that, I started thinking about this.
Oh my God, what would that be? What would be an example of a perverse?
The very classic example comes from St. Augustine. So St. Augustine writes the Confessions, like 1,600 years ago. And he begins a chapter saying, I'm going to talk to you about my most insane carnal desires. And he doesn't talk about sex. He talks about this one case where he and his friend go into an orchard. and they steal some pears. And what freaked Augustine out was they didn't eat the pears, they threw them to pigs. And he said, well, why did I do this? He said, I wanted to do something bad. I just wanted to, and then he goes, tries to so I set up this thing online called a Perversity Project, where I got people to send me stories about their perverse actions. And those stories will form the basis for this book.
Oh my God, you must have get some wild
I got some incredible ones. Some of them not safe for work, but really, really interesting things.
This is like when Bust did that survey on, have you ever thought about killing somebody you didn't like, and then write out your answers. Oh my God.
Yes.
What people were thinking, like, holy crap.
Yes. Asking people to send you their deepest thoughts is always a risky thing.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, Paul, thank you for your work and your friendship and for coming on.
Real pleasure. Thank you for having me again. That was a great
conversation. Really one of the best. That was really great.
Thank you.